This story happened to me when I was about 7 years old. We lived in a relatively big town in Russia. Towns, unlike villages, are known for their tall, multiple apartment buildings. I wouldn't dare call them skyscrapers, but some of them were known to go up to the 24th floor or something. Ours, for example, had 9 stories, and our apartment was on the 8th floor. Just to give you a bit of an idea. A detail you also need to know is that each floor had 4 apartments, 2 on each side separated by the staircase. This separation left room for a tiny hallway. Some people would claim this hallway theirs and install a door right at the beginning of the hallway to have extra protection for the 2 apartments on the side. Our apartment had that extra hallway, and the door installed was wooden and very old. When we first moved in, we were curious to see who our neighbors in the apartment directly to the left were. Turned out it was a family of 3, a mother and her 2 sons in their late 20s. She worked really hard to provide for those sons, who seemed very healthy at first. Tall, lean, talkative. Although I couldn't really grasp the idea of an addiction or drugs in general, I remember being repulsed by the idea that we lived right next to heroin junkies though. They seemed harmless enough since their mother provided enough to get them what they needed, but I did remember stories of them stealing on occasion or climbing into their apartment down from the roof whenever they forgot to take their keys. One day I overheard a conversation that their mother would not be able to make enough money anymore. This meant the family was going to be looking for a cheaper place to stay. I can still make out that woman's facial features. She always looked so tired and sad, but she tried her best to smile whenever she saw me. Although we didn't initially agree, our grandmother moved into their empty apartment a couple of months later, and I started to like it more, being able to step out of our apartment and just go see my grandma whenever. The wooden hallway door protected us from the stairway and provided a sense of having a huge family in one house, even though I was the only child at that time. My parents were fairly busy people. My mom ran a business and my dad was an engineer. My grandmother had already retired, but she had a good piece of land out in the village that she used for gardening, so she too was very busy keeping her crops alive. Although I was fairly little, I was raised to be a responsible and aware human being. I hate stereotypes, but when it comes to crime in Russia, I must admit they're quite true. The idea of having a babysitter was not widely spread until the 2000s or maybe later, so whenever my parents had to leave, I would have to take care of myself. Sometimes I would go and visit Grandma, but when she was gone too, well, let's just say I didn't complain. I would watch cartoons and talk on the phone a lot, and even eat jam straight out of the jar. This day was one of those days. I'd just turned the TV on and gotten my party started. As always, I turned up the volume and attempted to sing along and dance to the music. I was all by myself, so I was going to enjoy the hell out of it. That was until I was startled by a loud boom. A typical sound the door to my grandma's apartment made. It was a bit old but modified from the outside with some kind of leather cushion. It provided a bit more insulation, but also made it a lot more difficult to open or close the door. You had to really yank it. Otherwise, you couldn't do anything. I felt a little bit embarrassed for my loud, goofy singing, so I turned off the TV and went to see if my grandma had just returned home. I knocked on her door. Nothing. "Grandma, you home?" I asked so she'd hear me coming. Still nothing. I grabbed the keys for her door and opened it slowly. Grandma, are you here?" Even though I had a feeling she was not home, a strange sensation creeped through my body. I was completely sure I'd just heard her door slam, but it seemed like nobody was there. I looked around and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so I did my best to shrug it off as me just hearing something. I went back inside our apartment and continued to sing to myself. A couple of minutes later, though, I heard that same noise again. Trying not to freak out, I turned off the TV and went to see if my grandma was really there this time. Maybe she'd left very quickly because she'd forgotten something, and now she'd actually returned. I know, but I had to calm myself down somehow. Again though, nothing. She was not home. I went inside again and made sure to turn the lock 3 extra times just to make sure. I was waiting for the 3rd time, my heart pounding, and I could hear it beating in our quiet apartment. I was terrified because I knew now someone must be trying to mess with me. I couldn't figure out how this noise was happening, or where they were, but I knew they wanted to be inside. I heard that sound once more. A little more quiet, like they were trying to be sneaky, but still loud enough to make a note of it. Terrified to even look out the peephole, I looked at our hallway once I managed to catch my breath. Nothing. A couple of seconds after that, I had the courage to slightly open our door and look outside. Just like I'd seen through the peephole, everything seemed to be fine in the hallway. Everything was fine with our door, my grandma's door, our hallway door. Wait, what? One of the locks on the hallway door was hanging out with only 1 screw left. The other, a smaller one, fell down onto the floor. The steel latch was completely bent in. I honestly don't know how I didn't pee myself. Seriously. I ran to the door with the broken locks and tried desperately to secure it somehow. A couple of seconds later, though, I realized nothing could be done. I ran back inside and locked the door tight. Even though I'd been taught to call the police in case of an emergency, I called my friend from the same building first, hoping her father would be there. He was, luckily. Crying and sobbing, I explained my situation best I could, and he showed up immediately. His presence seemed to have scared off whoever it was, and I felt relieved. The locks had been destroyed, and so was the hallway door. It was made completely impossible to repair. That day, we called the door company and ordered an installation of a heavy iron door instead. You remember me telling you about those former neighbors? Well, apparently the family was doing worse and worse financially, so those junkies became regular visitors at police stations for theft and other minor crimes. This time, one of them must have remembered where they used to live, so he thought it would be easy to break in. The door in the hallway was weak, so it would eventually give way. They just didn't expect me to be home. I can't believe those were the same people who'd acted so friendly and seemed harmless. They did eventually catch the one that tried to break in, but I never quite got rid of the fear of being alone in a place somebody tries to break into. I occasionally have nightmares that portray exactly that. So when I was just off to college out of high school, I, female and 18 at the time, moved in with my good friend Karen, 20, and her friend Tara, 21. We moved to New York City, but as rent is wildly expensive there, we wound up getting an apartment in the shadiest part of Harlem. It was a fairly decent place though. A doorman clinched the deal for us. The neighborhood was shady, but was normally alright. Not really a big deal, we just ignored the cat calls during the day and didn't really leave the apartment at night. Tara and I really hit it off from the beginning. She knew a bunch of fun places to go drinking where they wouldn't card me down in Manhattan. I hadn't really been doing that well emotionally lately, and she decided I could use a fun night out. We said, what the heck, screw it, we're going out then. Karen was back in our hometown that weekend, so she wouldn't be there with us. We got all dolled up for a night on the town and wore these stupid heels we would both later really regret. So Tara and I took 2 subway trains to this nice karaoke bar where good people get up to perform, and we just watched. We enjoyed the drunk theater people and their night off. Tara had a few drinks, but I had a few more than that. I was having a tough time walking in a straight line back to the subway by the end of the night. Still though, we were laughing and really glad we'd had a fun time together. Then we got on the first train home. We were sitting there waiting to reach our stop to transfer, when we both noticed this young guy with his hood all the way up over his face at the other end of the car, a few people down. Now, that wasn't super unusual for Manhattan. We tried to ignore him at first. It started to get a bit awkward though, as we could tell he was staring at us unrelentingly. We were dressed up, and some people just stare in the city, so whatever. Ignore him and he'll eventually go away, right? We finally get to our stop, and of course, the guy in the hoodie followed us off the train and to the stop for the next one we were supposed to catch. Alright, maybe still a coincidence. In a city of 8 million people, odds are someone is going to be going the same direction you are. Nevertheless, we kept a much closer eye on him. We didn't want to jump the gun with our accusations, but this was starting to feel really sketchy, especially with how much he was eyeing us. We were just trying to mind our own business, particularly as Tara had to keep me from tipping over every so often, which broke the tension and made us laugh for a moment. On the next train, though, we were the only passengers save for one other person, as well as that guy in the hoodie once more. We stayed absorbed in each other's company, giggling over some pictures on Tara's phone, hoping if we didn't pay attention to this guy he would get his fill of staring and decide he was no longer interested. Hopefully, especially if we laughed and made it look like we weren't afraid of him. At one point though, I glanced back at him because I couldn't help myself, and saw what looked like a piece of metal poking just barely out of the sleeve of that overly large sweatshirt. The man saw me looking, and we looked at each other in the face for the first time, maybe for a fraction of a second. The focus of his stare was so intense. His gaze was totally calm and confident. I looked back at Tara and widened my eyes, flicking them towards him in a sort of "holy crap, look at this guy" communication. She did. I was watching her face the entire time. I saw all the color drain as she too noticed that knife hidden up his sleeve. I didn't know what to do. It wasn't a good idea probably to call the police just then right in front of this guy in an abandoned subway car, and we were almost at our stop already anyway. When we got off, our apartment was about 4 blocks from the subway, so the way I figured it, we had a much better chance of getting home than of the police getting there to help us by the time we pulled in. As soon as the train stopped, we started to get out. My drunk ass immediately reached down and slipped off my shoes while walking towards the stairs to the street. Tara didn't bother, but was already halfway up. I turned around to see where the hoodie guy had gone, and there he was. He was strutting confidently toward me, his eyes completely deadpan, but never moving focus from me. I felt like I was going to vomit from fear. My stomach was twisting so much. It suddenly felt like I hadn't had a single drop to drink. I ran up the stairs behind Tara, and we both just let loose down the street. My mother had given me some pepper spray in a little bottle that looked like lipstick. It was a housewarming present. I tried to unzip my purse and get my hand inside while we were running, but with the state we were in, that was next to impossible. It was slowing me down too. I gave up and hoped I could get it out if he managed to catch us. When I looked back again, of course he was running too, only now he was no longer hiding his knife. It was right in his hands as he pumped his arms furiously. It looked like one of those big switchblades too, totally illegal. I kept glancing back even though I was running almost full out at this point, trying to keep Tara next to me with her heels still on. Maybe it's because I was so damn scared at the time, but it seemed like running was nothing to him. He was still so calm, barely even breathing heavy, and zeroed in on us. He stared straight into my eyes whenever I looked, and had this pitched little half smile on his face. It was completely calm, not grinning or angry or any kind of emotion I could recognize, just a sort of casual, "I'm going to catch you, you know," face. We ran past the usual group of homeless guys about halfway to our building, who made some kind of comment I couldn't hear. I assume they were making fun of us when they saw us running toward them, especially since I had no shoes on in this gross part of the city. I have to wonder though whether they helped us waylaying the guy after, because we managed to get to our building and have the doorman buzz us in with moments to spare. We ran, panting and half crying, to the doorman's desk, staring at the doors the entire time. We had just enough time to start explaining in hysterics that we were being followed. Immediately, there was a huge rattle at the doors. The man was there, shaking the handles violently, trying to rip open the doors to get to us. The doorman whipped out his walkie-talkie and yelled at us to go upstairs. We didn't need telling twice. We got in the elevator and held each other, shocked and crying, hearing shouting from outside the elevator doors. It faded as we went up to the 3rd floor, where our apartment was located. When we got upstairs, we went straight to our balcony, which was on the left side of the building. We had come to the front door from the right, but we thought maybe we'd be able to hear something from there. We did. We could hear yelling. Just one voice, pretty high for a man's. Clear and furiously shouting "fuck" over and over. After maybe a minute, it stopped, and we didn't hear anything else. The police showed up shortly afterward for statements, but as far as I know, they never found the guy. I moved out of the city shortly afterward, for a variety of reasons. My dad kinda still feels bad about it. He thought that Harlem was a nice, cheap option. But it's alright. Everything turned out okay in the end, and I'm not living there anymore. Still though, I've always kind of wondered why he followed us all the way from downtown, and why he didn't try to attack earlier. How did we get away exactly? Why had he wanted to stab us in the first place? A huge variety of things. The cool, detached expression on his face, paired with those intense eyes, has stuck with me ever since. I'm a female, and I was 14 at the time this happened. I'm from a big city in Germany, and that afternoon I wanted to buy a birthday present for a friend. I planned on taking the subway downtown, to where all the shops were. Even though my home city is fairly big, it's considered really safe, so I never really felt unsafe going to friends' houses or downtown all by myself. While I was waiting on the platform, this guy kinda slowly walked past me and stopped just a few meters away from me. I remember he must have been in his late teens or early 20s, and he had these glasses on. While I looked around the platform bored, since the subway wouldn't arrive for another 3 minutes, I noticed the guy was now staring at me. Being a rather shy girl back then, I very quickly looked away. After a few seconds, I wanted to check if he was still looking, so I peeked a quick glance. Surely enough, the guy was still staring, completely unblinking. This went on until the subway arrived. By then, I was feeling really uncomfortable. Luckily, there had been a few other people on the platform, so I still felt fairly safe. I got on and succeeded in snatching one of the few empty seats left. Since it was close to Christmas and the subway was completely packed up, I couldn't see the guy from my seat anymore, so I calmed down thinking he must have lost me. A couple of minutes later, I got off at my stop and took the escalator up to the street. While standing there on the escalator though, I got a sudden sharp feeling up my spine and turned around. My heart sank. The creepy guy from the platform was standing just a bit behind me on the same escalator, staring into my back. I tried to calm myself down. This station was a popular meeting spot, and a lot of people who wanted to go shopping got off there. Since it was close to Christmas, he was probably just doing some shopping for his family, right? When I arrived on the street, I turned right, walked down that street, and turned right again at the next corner. When I turned the corner, I quickly looked down the street I had come from. The guy was following me. I felt really uncomfortable now. I entered a bookshop and hid behind a bookshelf, waiting for the guy to walk to wherever he was heading to. After a few minutes, I went outside, and that was the moment I started to panic. I thought the guy must have walked past. It had been a long time since I'd hid. It turned out though the guy was standing just a few meters away, just out of sight, waiting. I should have run back into the store and called my parents to come pick me up. Instead, stupid 14-year-old me hoped there must be a more logical explanation for this guy's behavior. Maybe he was just waiting for someone else. I got out of the store and walked in the opposite direction of where that guy was. I started to walk faster, hoping that if he was following me, I would lose him amongst all the other shoppers that were now around. When I turned right at the next corner, as I was walking around the block, I looked back down the street again. He was now even closer behind me. I walked even faster and I felt like I was about to cry, but I knew I had to keep calm. I turned right once more. When I looked back and could still see him behind me, I was now positive he was following me. What other reason would he have to walk around the block entirely without entering any of the stores? I tried to think of a way to escape, when suddenly I saw my chance. The streetlight on the crossing just a few meters in front had just turned red, so I started sprinting as fast as I could. I managed to just barely make it to the other side before the traffic started flowing through. I looked back. The guy hadn't managed to make it across the street in time and was standing on the other side, waiting for the light to turn green again. He was still staring at me, but this time with a really creepy wide grin. At that moment, I felt as scared as I had never been before in my life. I started running again, this time into a huge department store a few meters away from me. Luckily, I knew that this particular store had another entrance at the back, facing a different street. On that street, there was usually a line of cabs waiting to pick up shoppers. I sprinted through the store and right out the other entrance. To my greatest relief, there was the usual line of cabs. I practically jumped into the first one. In tears, I told the cab driver my home address and shouted for him to go quickly. I frantically looked back to the door, expecting the man to burst out any moment. Fortunately, I didn't see him. I'm still thankful that the cab driver instantly started driving and only asked what happened and if I was alright when we were already a few blocks away. In tears and completely shaken, I told him about the man that had been following me and how scared I was. When we arrived at my parents' house, he refused to charge me and waited outside until I was safely indoors. To this day, I'm still grateful to that cab driver. I don't know if that guy who was following me was just playing a very cruel prank on me and just wanted to scare me, or if he had something way more sinister in mind. So this story didn't happen to me. It actually happened to my very good friend who we'll call Dan. Dan is a 5'10" man from Maryland. He had a very strange sense of humor and was a very smart but all-around good guy. Anyway, we went to the same university. I'm gonna tell this story as best as I can remember, so please bear with me. Dan moved into his dorm room before his roommate did our freshman year. Dan had everything all moved in and had settled in completely. Just as he sat down, his roommate showed up to move everything in. His roommate, we'll call him Brian, introduced himself and his mother and father, who were helping him move. He seemed just like any other person. Dan decided to help his new roommate move everything in, since he didn't know anyone yet and was from a different state. Dan and Brian's family get down to their car, as Brian stayed behind in the room to put things away. This is the first red flag in this story. As they were opening the trunk, Brian's father looked at Dan directly in the face and whispered, "Good luck." Dan thought he meant with classes. He said thanks and grabbed a box, but boy was he wrong. Dan carried that box upstairs and into the room, where Brian proceeded to flip out. He screamed about how that box had his special ingredients for a project he was doing, and Dan had probably broken it. Weird, but everyone has their quirks. They finished moving Brian in and his parents said goodbye, and again, Brian's dad told Dan good luck. It was really weird. Anyway, a couple of guys came by the door to ask if they wanted to go eat. Dan said sure, but Brian stayed behind to finish unpacking his things. While Dan was out, he got a call from Brian, asking if he would mind if he smoked weed in the room. Dan, being that he wanted to work for the CDC, said absolutely not. Brian screamed something unintelligible and hung up the phone. He called back a few minutes later and asked if he could smoke weed in the closet at least. Again, Dan said no. Brian hung up without a word, and Dan and his friends decided to go make sure he wasn't actually smoking in the room. When they arrived, they found him hiding in the closet like a goblin eating the weed. Weird as hell, right? Not even close to as bad as this will get though. As time continued on, at night, Brian would wake Dan up by standing beside his bed, standing over him, then asking him a single question. Dan would answer, and Brian would walk back to his bed and fall asleep. This happened every night for a week. At this point, Brian had moved in an entire toolbox full of wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, nails, screws, an assortment of power tools as well. These weren't the kinds of things you'd need with you in a college dorm room. During this entire week, Brian also never left the room. The only time he would move was to eat and go to the bathroom. About 4 days before the week where dorm room changes could be made, Brian woke Dan up in the middle of the night and asked him how he felt about gay people. Dan said he didn't really care what anyone did, and it was fine with him. When Dan woke up the next morning, Brian was sitting in a chair directly by his head, staring at his sleeping face. Of course, he instinctively yelled out, "What the fuck are you doing?" Brian replied, "I think I'm starting to have feelings for you. You need to move out. I don't want you getting hurt during what's coming." After that, Dan left and didn't sleep in his room for a couple of days until he could move. Unfortunately, though, there were no open rooms, so he couldn't. During this time, Brian started to follow Dan around. He would sleep in the closet with his tools, making something. Dan eventually convinced the head of the dorm to let him move into the now empty room next door, after 3 weeks in what he described as pure hell. Dan moved to the room next door, so no big deal, right? Wrong. 2 days later, Dan got a knock at the door at 9 a.m. Thinking it was Brian coming to fuck with him, he screamed out, "What the fuck do you want?" He answered the door in his boxers. At the door, though, there were 4 state police troopers in full hazmat gear. The man in front said, "Not who you were expecting, huh?" At least someone there had a sense of humor. They let Dan put some clothes on, then let him out the door. At the end of the hallway was Brian in handcuffs. Turns out Brian had been building pipe bombs and other sorts of explosives in the dorm room while Dan was away at class. After Dan had moved out, he took over the other bed and the closet for his bomb-making activities. The reason the hazmat team was there was because Brian had spilled liquid mercury all over the floor, and they were afraid it had seeped into the other rooms. When they went through all of Brian's things, they found a plan that also had guns hidden around the city. This kid had planned a massive attack. On a special note, though, he had written Dan's name down with a heart drawn around it, and wrote specifically, "Do not kill." Brian is obviously in prison now.